The time I was almost abducted by a serial killer. In February of 2012, I went to visit my grandfather's grave for his birthday. His death was a really hard thing for me to deal with, as he had died in March of 2011, and was still very fresh to me. I was kneeling in front of his grave with my head down, mourning and crying, when my body went into full danger's close-by mode. I looked up to see a man running full sprint from the woods surrounding the cemetery, and forced myself to get to my truck as quickly as possible, without the man getting too close to me. By the time I made it to my truck, he had gotten about 50 feet from me. I jumped in and locked the door, much to his apparent displeasure. He threw his hands up in a huff like his favorite team had just lost a football game. I started the truck and started to drive out as fast as I could, but not before driving right past him. I didn't break eye contact for a second, and neither did he. So I got a really good look at his face. Cut to a few years later. I'm at work bored and decided to download an app that had a ton of paranormal, cryptid, serial killer, and UFO articles. As I was browsing through the serial killers, I came across one that made my heart drop into my ass. Israel Keyes, most known for murdering an underage girl in Alaska, dismembering her body, and dropping the pieces into a frozen lake. He would bury kill kits in places long before he ever committed the crimes. After the incident in Alaska, he had traveled into Texas for a wedding in a city not too far from where I live and had disappeared for a bit, and no one in his family knew where he was. He was arrested in that city and brought to the prison one city over from me, before he was extradited back to Alaska to stand trial. About a year ago, I found a book about him that provided a lot of the details I have given here. He had been killing for years, and no one knows what the actual death toll is. He eventually killed himself in prison. At the end of the book about him, he described some of his favorite places to abduct people: public parks and cemeteries. I often wonder if there's a kid buried in those woods. You were fast, Israel, but I was faster, and I'm glad we didn't officially meet. I have someone actually living in my closet. I want to start this off by saying yes, I am safe, and yes, I moved. When I was 5, I was moved to a little town in Arkansas. My parents had picked a pretty big house, and we paid a little less than most houses on the market. For the sake of knowing details, it was a 2-story house with an accessible attic. I lived on the 2nd floor. The earliest memories I have of the house were me playing dolls in my room, sitting on my rug, and talking to my imaginary friend Celia. Celia was a shy girl, and she only came out to play when my parents were downstairs or on a work call, etc. I only lived in the house for a few years, so some of the stories my mom told me. The 3 things. 1. It started with things going missing. 2. Once a night, at the same time every single night, I would hear a tiny bell ring from my closet. For me being 6 years old, I thought nothing of it. Of course, I was a happy child, but I would always have my dad check under my bed, and in the closet. Whenever I heard the bell, I would go to the closet and open it, and Celia and I would hang out in my room. Because I was a child, I had to go to bed around 7 o'clock. Unless I was super tired, I would stay up playing with my dolls. As long as I was in bed, my parents wouldn't care if I was up. Once I heard the bell ring, Celia and I would talk about running away or going to take my parents' truck or something like that. I was a pretty good kid, so normally talked her out of it. I don't remember much from here, so number 3 is my mom's story. 3. My mom told me she never knew about Celia. She stated the same time every night she thought I was just talking to myself, playing with my toys like it was my little routine. She told me that one night she went to check on me and saw me with a dirty woman in my room. Obviously, she freaked out but didn't want to freak me out, so she suddenly shut the door as quietly as possible and sprinted downstairs. She called the cops and they told her to stay as calm as possible and make noise coming up the stairs so that I would know she was coming up. She and my dad took me out of the room and out of the house into the car. She locked the doors and she played music to keep me from getting frantic. When the police got there, they stormed into the house and came out with the woman. They said she had been living in my closet wall and there was a stash of stuff behind my dresser in a hole in the wall. We moved shortly thereafter. We heard nothing else about the woman. Memories from around 1998 in Greeneville, Tennessee. When I was a kid, I lived in Clinton, Tennessee. Both parents worked full-time, so I was often sent over to stay with my grandparents who had a plot of land in the vicinity of, but not right in, Mosheim, near Greeneville. Both of them had been in East Tennessee for their whole lives, in that area for a good many years. They had been established at their home for some decades before this story and remained there a good time after. Recently, I had reason to return to that area, Tennessee, after having spent the majority of my adult life in Minnesota. Being in and around the area, driving the same roads made me reminiscent about my lazy summer days tucked away at my grandparents'. Learning to shoot on the same .22 with which Grandpa had taught Mom, feeding fish at a neighbor's stocked pond, or spotting deer and bear with binoculars from the back porch. When I relayed this to my mom, she in turn told me a story about a time I scared my grandpa half to death, then lied about hanging out with Bigfoot. At first I had no idea what she was on about. Then I remembered exactly what actually happened with startling clarity. New context given by the experience adulthood provides. And no, this is not about Bigfoot or a cryptid. Before we start, some information about my grandparents' land. Their house was on a small hill surrounded by a grass lawn. The lawn gave way to a smallish hayfield, then the wood line. Those woods lasted for a good half-mile on either side of the home, and a good several miles to the back. I hated the hayfield because it was too pokey to play in, but liked to hang out in a creek that ran behind it. To get there I would walk to the edge of the property just in the wood line to avoid the hay. While at my grandparents', the only rules were that I stay where I could see the house, so the house could see me, and I was to take a whistle with me anywhere I went. I didn't take the whistle, seeing it as a badge of my regrettably young age. And the best part of the creek was out of sight of the house. That was the only stretch where it got deeper than my knees, and thus the only part where I could swim. Naturally, I spent much of my time in that water, splashing around, skipping stones, and being a kid. One day I was playing in the creek when I noticed someone. It was a man, a stranger, on the bank watching me. He had long hair, a beard, and pale skin, so dirty it was stained. I could not tell his age and simply thought of him as old. I have no better guess now, as he clearly went through long years of hard living. He wore no shirt, no pants, only a wrap of dirty cloth around his waist that I thought of as a Moses dress thanks to some illustrated Bible stories. Around his neck there were multiple necklaces made from knotted tatters of cloth, fiber, and string. In those knots were various pieces of detritus, mostly bones, but some flowers and bits of dark glass. When I first saw him there by the creek I was terrified. Terrified. Frozen still. The man, however, was smiling. He gestured from his squat with an outstretched arm, fingers down, in a kind of "don't stop for me" wave. I didn't react, startled and reeling. Then he splashed at me, still smiling. He did it again. I splashed back. And soon we were playing. We both threw water at each other. He jumped into the creek and stomped around with me, laughing all the while. He threw rocks into the water and so did I. I pushed him, he pushed me back. We carried on for some minutes until my grandma called for me. With her voice, a switch had turned off. The man stopped in his tracks, gaze fixed back toward the house. Then as my grandma kept on hollering, he looked to me. He crept back to his side of the creek, barely disturbing the water, then slid into the brush, completely silent the whole way, holding my gaze. Once he was out of sight, I waited in the water until my grandma found me. She wanted to know if I was alone. I said no. She became very tense, asking who was with me while looking around. I didn't answer, didn't know how. Seeing no one, she pulled me back to the house without any more words, gripped like iron the whole time. At the house, the real inquisition began. I didn't really have new words, the event and this reaction, overwhelming my ability to explain. Such silence further irked my grandma, and I was swiftly placed in a corner, held without bail, awaiting patriarchal judgment. Around an hour later, my grandpa came home from work. He was told about my churlishness and was ready to set into me again when I started talking. I told him about the man, hairy and old, dressed like Moses. About how we played, then he disappeared. I remember they digested this for a few minutes before sending me to my room. I was happy to go, and happier still Grandpa did not yell like he usually did when I misbehaved. Later, I was brought out for dinner. I ate in the kitchen with Grandma, but Grandpa called me to the back porch. He was on the swinging bench, looking out over the hayfield turned red by the setting sun. He had kicked off his boots and put them next to his shotgun. I knew that was odd for the gun to be out of the closet. Previously, we had used it to shoot bottles, some I would throw into the air like they were clay pigeons. These escapades were accompanied with speeches about how the gun was dangerous and only for adults to use. He went through my story again, his tone deadly serious. Eventually, he asked me how Harry was the man, really. I told him very, thinking this was the right answer. He asked where, I told him everywhere, like a bear. He ruminated on this, and I grew more nervous. Worried I was in trouble, or causing trouble, just wanting the trouble, wherever it lay, to end. So when he finally asked me to swear, in the name of Christ and on my mother, that I was telling the truth about everything, I said I had been joking. He finally yelled then, and sent me back to my room. Around an hour later, my grandpa came home from work. He was told about my churlishness and was ready to set into me again when I started talking. I told him about the man, hairy and old, dressed like Moses. About how we played, then he disappeared. I remember they digested this for a few minutes before sending me to my room. I was happy to go, and happier still Grandpa did not yell like he usually did when I misbehaved. Later, I was brought out for dinner. I ate in the kitchen with Grandma, but Grandpa called me to the back porch. He was on the swinging bench, looking out over the hayfield turned red by the setting sun. He had kicked off his boots and put them next to his shotgun. I knew that was odd for the gun to be out of the closet. Previously, we had used it to shoot bottles, some I would throw into the air like they were clay pigeons. These escapades were accompanied with speeches about how the gun was dangerous and only for adults to use. The family memory became that I had hid by the creek and made up a tale about Bigfoot. At the time, everyone was very upset with me, and I was forbidden from going back to the creek or anywhere out of sight. The enforcement of this rule, like the others, was lackluster. Even so, for a time, I didn't go to the creek. In my memory, I stayed away for a very long time, but I am sure it was only a few days, that hiatus feeling interminable to my elementary-aged self. When I did start going to the creek, I took a bucket of toys, mostly Godzilla, and a thick stick plucked from the woodline on the way. I think I was conflicted about what to do if the man came back, imagining either impressing him with my toy collection or clubbing him. Or both in turn. When he did show back up, he appeared next to me as I dozed under a tree on my side of the creek. I was once again gripped with terror. He was not smiling. His face expressionless as he lurked beside me, having watched for who knows how long before I smelled him. I scrambled away, leaving behind my stick and toys. Coming to my feet a yard out, I stood in the sun while the man watched me from the shade. Eventually he crouched and started to look through my bucket. I remember becoming indignant as he examined my toys one by one only to toss them into the dirt. It became too much and I started to lecture the man, telling him about how he got me in trouble, how he was a weirdo, how he stank. At some point he stopped looking through my things and calmly watched my tirade. Face still neutral, eyes analytic. Once I had concluded my lecture, I sat back under the tree to pout, having become hot in the sun. I remember the man made a noise, a grinding kind of snort, and when I looked over at him, he was chuckling while he inspected the last few figures in my bucket. I wanted to laugh too, but was more determined to stay sullen. Once everything was out of the bucket, he put one figure, Ghidorah, back into the bucket. He then stood to his hunched fullest, took the bucket by its handle, began to make his way back into the woods. I stayed by the tree until he turned, said something, not a word I knew or know, and gestured with a forward sweep of his hand. At first I didn't comply despite knowing he wanted me to follow. After a few moments he yipped, clicked his teeth, and gestured again more emphatically. With this further prompt, I did get up and come along, the man making approving noises and putting on his smile again. We went into the woods. The man lead, but he was naturally quicker and quieter, making it hard to keep up. Eventually, he would stop when he lost me, knocking on trees with sticks and whistling rhythmically so that I may find him in the vegetation. He never came back for me, opting instead to guide me forward with the noises. I became lost, having only a vague sense of my grandparents' place being behind me. After some time, maybe 15 minutes, we came to a bare patch. The man had me wait there, indicated by patting the ground, before going into the tree line alone. He returned from a different direction, pulling a sled. It was made from half of a discarded plastic drum and lined with small pelts and smooth bark. On the back half, there rested the fly-covered carcasses of squirrels, possums, and other critters savaged into anonymity. On the pulling end, woven pouches were tied into place on it by the same eclectic cordage that made the man's necklaces. He put my bucket on the sled and tossed Ghidorah in a pouch. He then called me closer with a glottal noise and beckoning wave. I saw the sled's pouches held many odds and ends. Dried salamanders, mushrooms, metal bits, glass fragments. From one the man pulled a score made from bound-together sticks, just big enough to slip over my wrist. From another he pulled a piece of fool's gold and a small shard of geode crusted with a bit of purple crystal. These he handed to me with an air of business and a few more utterings of nonsense. He then patted the group for me to sit again. I did so without much bewilderment, understanding we had treated the same as exchanging Pokemon cards at recess. I did not much miss Ghidorah anyway, as he was a bad guy. The bucket was a loss. In retrospect, I think Ghidorah was chosen because its dull gold scales resembled something valuable. The bucket for its obvious ability to hold things. The man came back and gestured for me to follow by slapping his thigh. I did this readily. During the hike back I tried to keep up and pay attention. I did so moderately well, having to be whistled over a few times. I did notice that our path was not straight. The man lead me one way and then another, making turns unneeded by the lay of the land. We eventually came out by the creek, but from a different approach than we had left. I could hear my grandma calling for me again, not from up on the hill, from out in the field. The man would not cross the creek, but pushed me to do so. I did, but did not go to my grandma. Instead I crept back to the house and around to the opposite side. There I laid the shrubs by our front door, pretending to sleep. I was found. I swore I had been there the whole time. When I was sent back to my room I placed my fool's gold, crystal, and charm in my bedside table for safekeeping. The next day I went back to the creek to pick up my toys. The man was not there. However, throughout that summer he did visit me again, to sit under the tree, or throw rocks at the water, or yammer softly to himself. I would bring snacks and candy to share, and he would likewise give me stringy dried meat, which I ought not to have ate, or honeysuckle blossoms, which I still would eat, taken from my old bucket. He seldom visited long, and never splashed and hooped like he did on that first meeting. At this point you may be wondering why I have posted to Backwoods Creepy and not Backwoods Seared but Wholesome, I guess. Well, there are 2 more occasions I wanted to account. One gruesome, one awful. The eventful one occurred near the 4th of July. I had brought 2 boxes of bang snaps to the creek. The man was initially wary of the little fireworks, but quickly came to appreciate their miniature pyrotechnics. He took the box I gave him gratefully, even taking the empty box, likely for the wood shavings, which are excellent tinder. During the use of the bang snaps I had scared a turtle into the water and to the opposite bank. It sat there watching us from the far shore. The man, after stowing the bang snaps in a bucket, noticed the turtle. With little thought he scooped up a smooth stone and threw it with force and accuracy into the turtle. He then waded over to retrieve the slider, which struggled meekly in his grasp, one leg knocked clean off. On my side of the river he took from the bucket a new piece of stone. One side was rounded and fit in his hand. The other came to a flinty cutting edge. Working with deft experience, the man began chopping the live turtle above its neck, pulling up on the shell top. The thing struggled and bled as it was bisected. The dome eventually coming free, the turtle dropped to mingle its viscera with dirt and sand. The man rinsed the shell in the river, then offered it to me. In wordless horror, I ran. That evening I came back to shuffle the dead turtle into the flowing waters of the creek. The shell itself was nowhere to be found. This experience did nor deter me from going to the creek, or the man from visiting again. However, sometimes he would try to call me away from the creek with thumps and whistles. I would tell him I heard him and refused to move. On some occasions he would join me. On others he would leave. The last time we met we were sitting under the tree sharing cowtails. From the woods there came whistling and the staccato knocking of a woodpecker. The man looked up and whistled back. There were a few more such exchanges before he stood, collected his bucket, and beckoned for me to follow. I was curious, and felt comfortable with the man as a guide, so I did as asked. He took me back to the bald. A direct path this time, periodically stopping to call or respond to the other in the wood. Waiting for us at the bald was a woman and a child. The woman was dressed the same as the man. Topless, wrapped at the waist. She was dirty, with long hair and a wiry frame. The child was in a similar state, wearing a sack that went to their knees. The man sat on the ground and the woman joined him, sitting in his lap but leaning forward so that her elbows rested on her crossed knees. She had dark brown eyes that were fixed to me. The other child would not look up. I didn't know what to do, and didn't speak. The other kid lifted their sack to wipe at their nose, and I learned under all that dirt they were her. The man made a noise and drummed on woman's bare back. The kid looked at them, still hanging her head, hair covering her face. The woman yammered and swatted at the girl lazily. The man echoing her noises, slapping skin to skin once more. At this bizarre scene the girl stumbled toward me, stopping close enough I could smell her and hear her wheezing breath. She was thin, but not emaciated, and slightly taller than me should she have straightened up. The man and woman fussed some more, then the girl leaned close and pressed her cheek to mine. Her hair was in between us, greasy and cold. She made no move to embrace me, no move at all. Only pressing limply against me and breathing so loud it was all I could hear. During this time the woman had approached. She pulled the girl back by her shoulder with one hand and delivered a flurry of slaps to the crown of the girl's head. The woman then gathered the girl's hair in one hand, using the other to sweep back her bangs. The girl was then made to look at me, face bare. One side of her jaw was bulged out, smooth skin over a lemon-shaped bump. Her mouth was twisted by this deformity. Her nose faced to one side as if affixed sideways and leaked a trail of clear snot. One eye was bulged and roomy, the other startlingly regular. It looked at me, blank and dark brown. The woman gave the girl's head a little shake, spat off to the side, then cooed like a dove as she smiled at me. I fled. There was commotion behind me. I think the girl was pushed to the ground. I did not look back and they did not pursue. My flight ended at my grandparents' house, my absence unnoticed. I chose not to tell anyone what happened. Wanting to forget. Not wanting to get in trouble. Not thinking about the girl, the couple, what was intended for me. I spent that August inside whenever I visited my grandparents. I begged not to be taken, claiming it was boring and lonely. Sometimes, when I sat on the porch or went from the car to the house, I'd catch a snippet of bird call in the wind or the distant tapping of wood and hurry inside. My grandma could tell something was wrong and made an effort to entertain me in town. My grandpa cared in his own way, involving me in his errands as he never had before. Eventually school started. Classes and friends eased me away from thoughts of the dirty man or the people in the clearing. Time did the rest. I think now that all of the people in the clearing were of a family. But their features, white skin, brown eyes, brown hair, are common enough that they all could have been unrelated. I am sure they lived together. They knew each other's signs and signals. They used their own words. I know that the Smokies are full of tales of feral people, wild men, and superstition. I also know that they are full of people living in unlikely ways in unlikely places. And that those real people call others kin. And that through the chain of human connection, even a recluse living in a rundown shack is someone's somebody. I guess I am asking if the people in my story are somebody's someone. Or if they are known. Or if their behavior rings any bells, belies any known intention. I figured here, where the tale would not be discounted out of hand, might be the right place to ask. Thank you for joining me. If you enjoyed these stories, please subscribe and hit the like button. I will see you next time on The Dark Side of My Room.